Look, thank you all for coming. It's great that we've got such a fantastic group here today. And Harris asked me to share some of my experiences in terms of negotiating the coalition. It was obviously the first time I'd done any such thing, so it was a kind of learning experience as well as something I hope that through talking about can be of benefit to you guys as well. I'll just say a wee bit about myself first of all. I'm an MP in the north of Scotland. Inverness, Nairn, Badenoch and Strathspey is my constituency. I shan't test you on that at the end of the session. I grew up in a remote community in the far north of Scotland. From a pretty ordinary family. Went to a state primary school and a state secondary school, and got involved in politics during my time at university. I went to work for the Lib Dems for a couple of years after graduating, and then I spent most of my time before becoming an MP in 2005 working on various European organisations. So there's some European connections over here, so we might dwell on that at some point. Got elected to Parliament in 2005, helped to run Nick Clegg's leadership election campaign. He and I have been friends for a long time before either of us entered Parliament, and then became his Chief of Staff after he was elected, and also took on responsibility for writing our election manifesto, which obviously is the list of policies that we were putting to the British people in the 2010 election. So I suspect to a lot of people watching, the prospect of a coalition government or of negotiations between parties to form a government as a result of the people of this country having delivered an inconclusive election result was a bit of a surprise. We haven't had coalition governments in peacetime in this country for very many years, and it was a novel experience for the country. To me and to my group of colleagues, it was not entirely unexpected, and this is perhaps the first thing. For these sorts of situations, being prepared is a good thing. So, about 9 months before the election in May 2010, Nick Clegg and I agreed that we would set up a very sort of small and, frankly, quite secret group whose job was to prepare for the various scenarios that might emerge, given that an election outcome, which was a balanced or hung parliament, was at least. I don't think it was necessarily the pollsters' lead option, but it was there as a sort of perhaps a 30% chance, and we knew that would immediately call on us to make some pretty difficult decisions in fairly quick time. And the more prepared we could be for those eventualities, the better. So I might say a bit about the preparation, a bit about the experience of negotiation, and then a bit about the negotiation that led to the formation of the government, and then a bit about the kind of ongoing experience since then, because I think they're all relevant to the subject of today. Firstly, in terms of preparation, we had a very small team. I led it with my parliamentary colleagues David Laws, Chris Huhne and Andrew Stunnell, and a very small amount of support from people who worked professional staff in the leader's office. And we spent time considering a number of things, one of which I'll come to. We should probably have spent more time on. And they were, what were the kind of likelihood of different scenarios? So a scenario where the Liberal Democrats and Conservatives were the most likely option, where the Liberal Democrats and Labour were the most likely option, and where there was a choice, or all the options would be mathematically possible. Clearly, having a number of MPs that between the two parties gives a majority in Parliament is a crucial part of having a combination that can work effectively in the UK political system, because without a majority you're unable to carry your legislation. You can't carry your legislation, you can't be an effective and stable government. And clearly not least in the context of the very, very difficult economic situation that we were operating, any one of the sort of tests of any arrangement would be that it was sufficiently stable and strong to deliver the sort of, painful and difficult choices that any government would have had to take in this Parliament. And part of that was about considering the political appetite for those arrangements. Part of it was about looking at what were the policy propositions that the different parties were putting forward and looking at areas of overlap and similarity. But also part of it was about looking at, in a Parliament where there's no overall majority, a coalition is not the only option. You could have arrangements whereby the leading party formed a minority government, so they would form a government on their own, but they would have an arrangement with the Liberal Democrats in this case, where we would agree to support them on the most important things, votes of confidence and so on, and on the financial measures. And otherwise we could step back and not be part of the government, but offer our own critique and our own alternatives as we went along. Experience in other countries is that can work well, but also that it can be quite fragile. And so if a big challenge emerges, then in other countries sometimes those arrangements have broken down. So we'd spend a lot of time looking at different scenarios and also a lot of time thinking about negotiating techniques. And I think something important here is about the psychology of it. So some people would say, well, if one of the other parties has achieved, they've nearly got a majority and you've just got a few MPs, well, then you should just accept that you should go along with what they want and not be too demanding. But the truth is that in an election situation, you've gone out and you have put your policies to the British people, and people have voted for you on the basis of the ideas that you have that you've put forward, and particularly where there are the major policies you're campaigning on. People will rightly expect that you would drive a hard bargain, that you would use an opportunity to deliver your values, and in the end, a negotiation between two parties has to be a negotiation of equals, has to be a negotiation where both sides has something to gain from it. And so I think we spent some time thinking about negotiation, talking to people who had experience of other negotiations, not least in local government, where coalitions are much more common. And so I think the attitude that you go into these negotiations with is critically important. That said, obviously the result of the election was, no one could have foretold exactly what the result would be, and it takes two to tango. You need to have a willing negotiating partner to have a successful negotiation, and the result of the election in 2010 was that in terms of parliamentary arithmetic, in terms of numbers of MPs, Liberal Democrats and Conservatives were the two parties that could form a government with a significant majority. Liberal Democrats and Labour, we would together just have fallen short, with a few MPs short of an overall majority. That would have left any, aside from all the issues about Labour having been defeated in the election, and I think many people in the Labour Party not wishing to carry on in government. They'd had 13 years, that they wanted someone else to have a go, and they could see what was coming. But also, having to rely on, very small parties like the Scottish or Welsh Nationalists or the Northern Irish parties in every single vote in Parliament would have been an inherently unstable arrangement. Though we did spend some time talking to Labour to try and understand, whether they were serious about this. In the end, those were the considerations that made that unlikely to work. With the Conservatives, a number of their spokespeople during the election campaign had spent time talking about what a disaster they thought coalitions would be, and how they had been of the opinion that a coalition could be a weak and unstable arrangement, and what you really needed was an overall majority for one party. I think it is very much to David Cameron's credit that the electorate, having delivered the result that they did, that he made a very positive and open offer to say, let's have discussions about forming a government. I think then, from a Liberal Democrat point of view, I'd say that our strengths were having prepared in advance in the way that I described. Secondly, having a very clear idea of what our main priorities were. So I don't expect you to have all read the 2010 Liberal Democrat election manifesto, though there'll be extra brownie points for those who have. One of the things we decided to do, I think, principally as a technique of clear communications, but also as a way of prioritising our policies in this eventuality, was to highlight on the front page of our manifesto the 4 policies that were most important to us. Cutting income tax for working people, a pupil premium in our school system to try and advance the education of children from disadvantaged backgrounds, a greener economy, and political reform of various sorts. And so, having structured our manifesto in that way, we had a very clear sense of what our priorities were. We felt that we had to make progress on all 4 of those things, given that they were our 4 key asks. Otherwise, it wouldn't be possible to go forward. And it was interesting that the Conservatives had, they'd understood our manifesto in that way and had prepared for that. That might be the view that we would take. Of course, then there was a whole range of other issues, and I would say that one of the important things about our negotiations with the Conservatives was that whilst no one knew what the outcome would be, or even if we would in the end get a positive outcome, both negotiating teams, our team that I led, the Conservative team that was led by William Hague, went into this from the very beginning with a very good attitude. That we were working positively to achieve as much as we could towards the objective of giving the country a strong and stable government, which was capable of making decisions and that had an agenda of reform. And that actually was evident from the very first minute of our conversations. And again, I think on both sides, that going into it with the right attitude, it is much harder to reach the right outcome. That said, there were quite a few difficult and complicated issues where the opinion of the 2 parties was very wide apart. I'll just give one example, which was about political reform and reforming the voting system in this country, which has been a long-standing commitment of Liberal Democrats and something that we are very attached to. But equally, the current system is something that the Conservatives are very attached to, and they've been constantly and very strongly against any reform. And that was an issue where we decided in our negotiations to deal with the difficult issues first. I mean, we could have had a very nice time for the first day or two talking about things we agreed about, but that in the end would be worth nothing if on the difficult things we couldn't make progress. And so I think it was very mature to say, the difficult things, let's sort them out, and then the other issues will follow more naturally. But the Conservatives had to go through some quite difficult decisions of their own before they could eventually get to the position that we accepted, which was offering a referendum on reform of the voting system. And for a while we were not sure that they would be able to move sufficiently in that direction to enable us to sign up to something. And at one stage we did start saying, well, if we can't make a coalition work, could we make a lesser arrangement, a sort of confidence supply arrangement work? But I think that both sides felt that that was, for the times we were in, that would be insufficiently ambitious, and that's why in the end I think they went back and came up with a new offer that we were able to accept. I think it's very important in these negotiations to remember that you're not negotiating on your own behalf, you're negotiating on the behalf of a much wider group of people. In our case, not just on behalf of Nick Clegg as the party leader, but on behalf of the whole parliamentary party, and beyond that, the whole party. And I actually think for the Liberal Democrats, our internal democratic processes were actually a real strength at that time, because firstly, we knew that we wouldn't reach an agreement unless we were able to persuade both our. Actually, it's quite amusing. The very first thing we discussed in our first meeting with the Conservatives was we said, well, let's describe the two parties' internal processes, because it's quite important to understand how the people you're negotiating with can get consent and reach an agreement. And that always involves going back to the people who on whose behalf you're negotiating, and making sure that they're willing to go along with what you've negotiated. And so William Hague said, well, we have to go back to David Cameron, and if he agrees, well, that's it, and we'll go and tell our MPs this is what we've done. But you have to remember that, I think his phrase was, the Conservative Party is an absolute monarchy moderated by regicide. And I then spent 10 minutes describing our federal executive, which is an elected committee that runs the party, and our federal policy committee, which looks at our policies, and our parliamentary group, who would need to consent to it, and then the special conference would have to be called so that all of our party members could have a chance to have their say before the thing was finally approved. And I could see the sort of colour draining from their faces around the table. But actually, I think that it was a strength for the Liberal Democrats in two senses. Firstly, it meant that as negotiators, we had a strong hand to play, because if we could be clear with our Conservative interlocutors that if we couldn't persuade people, then there was no deal. And secondly, I think it's been a real strength through the period of the coalition government, because the party as a whole, having given its consent, the parliamentary party, where our MPs, none of our MPs voted against it, a very small number abstained, but the vast majority was in favour. And then our special conference, where there was an overwhelming majority of party members in favour of forming a coalition. That means everybody's involved in making the decision. And when everyone's involved in making the decision, it's much harder then for people to wish to want to go back on it. And so I think it's been a strength in terms of the sustainability of the government, because once we'd reached the agreement, then of course you've got to spend time, work hard to establish the good working relationships with people who you haven't. You've been political opponents for a long time. So I'd spent time, in Parliament. I was then Shadow Work and Pensions Minister for a while, and then as Nick's Chief of Staff, you spend all your time attacking your rival parties and explaining why what they're doing is disastrous, and they do the same to you. And sometimes you get to know people in other parties in Parliament. That's a strength. But to then have to go from that frame of mind to one where you're working together for the good of the country within a coalition government, it does put a premium on having relationships that work, on getting to know the people with whom you're working with on the other side, and making sure that they know you and they know what your bottom lines are, but that you can continue to work together. So we formed the initial coalition agreement. Didn't look at every policy area. It looked at most policy areas, the difficult ones where we knew there were differences of opinion, or the important ones like the economy, which were going to be the essence of what the government was about. But actually, once we'd agreed to form the government, Oliver Letwin and myself then went away and filled out, working with others, the agreement on the rest of the policies that the government would pursue. And that was presented a couple of weeks later as a programme for government. So, as it were, the negotiation didn't stop, even when the big decision had been made. I think the thing that we didn't spend enough time thinking about is within the coalition, what are the processes within the government that then sustain it and make it strong? And I think we did that successfully at the sort of senior levels in the government, if you like. So we developed, I think, through our first emergency budget, when we set out our economic plan, we developed this idea of the Quad, where myself and the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister sit together and work through in a position of equal representation of both parties, the difficult economic decisions that the country has to make. And I think that group works well, and it gives a strength at the centre of the government. But one of the things that we should have picked up on was something that had been said to me and to others by Jim Wallace, who had been the leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats. The Scottish Liberal Democrats had been in coalition with the Labour Party for 2 terms in the Scottish Parliament, and so there was some recent experience of coalition formation within the party. Jim was an important advisor to us as we were preparing for the coalition negotiations. And he said, make sure you write down precisely all the details of the inner workings of the government. And we did that at a high level. We didn't really work through it in the way that he said. I think partly the goodwill of the initial period meant that we just all wanted to get on with governing in the way that we had said. And I think as time's gone on, that's a lesson that I've drawn for any future coalition negotiations. It's very important to be clear at the start, in quite a detailed way, how you intend the thing to operate. Clearly, it's a time-limited partnership, for one Parliament, and we and the Conservatives will go to the country as independent parties. We'll have our own manifestos, our own different ideas, our own take on the future of the country. But you need to be sure, particularly as you get closer to an election and the political pressures get stronger, that you're able to continue to work effectively, and that's something that we've had to work on, perhaps more than we should have done if we'd really thought about it at the very, very start. So I think I might sort of stop there, Harris, and maybe open up discussion and Q&A. I think that my kind of lessons would be prepared in advance for what you're going to do. Know what your most important asks are, know what your bottom lines are, know the things that you can't agree to. Enter into this exercise with, as well as those things, with a degree of goodwill on all sides, and be very clear about the processes that you have to go through in order to get the agreement of the people on whose behalf you're negotiating. And there is no point trying to conceal things from the people that you're negotiating with. You need to be transparent with them about what you can and can't do, because otherwise, neither side will have a proper and honest understanding of what the limits are. And I think with those things you can achieve a successful negotiation, and then you need to maintain all of those things throughout the period of, in this case, government, but it could be other sorts of partnerships that are being negotiated, because in the end, when you've got 2 parties working together, day by day, week by week, month by month, while you're working together, it's almost a permanent negotiation sometimes. You're constantly trying to, because no matter how comprehensive your election manifesto or your coalition agreement is, most of the things that happen over the 5 years of a parliament are things that you would not have been able to anticipate when you started out. And so you need to constantly have those principles in mind in order to keep the show on the road and be successful.
What's the difference when you're negotiating with your coalition partner and negotiating with MPs in your own party?
Basically, when you enter the coalition government, or when you're in kind of initial kind of negotiations, you were a much smaller party, of course, compared to the Conservatives. Mm-hmm. So what strategies did you use to increase your political power? I don't know what the actual term is. How do you kind of increase your bargaining power in that circumstance?
How do you actually arrive at a result if you're discussing an issue, like as in day to day? So do you all sit in a room and say, iron out all the things, like how do you actually address the disagreements, and do you come to some kind of compromise, or what are the activities you take or the steps you take to ensure both parties actually will agree?
I might start with the last question actually, because I think it illuminates the other two questions. But I'll come and make some additional points on each of those. I think it's worth saying first that our process in this country for forming a coalition government, we did the job in 5 days. In some other countries, they take a great deal longer. I think in Belgium, it takes an average of 200 days to form a coalition. Now, one couldn't realistically leave the United Kingdom without a government for 200 days in the middle of an economic crisis. That would be a recipe for making things much worse. Though, of course, each country has its own political culture, and it's not a criticism. It's just a reflection on our own system. And even taking 5 days, we were under pressure. People saying to us, "Well, you can't take much longer," or people will start to question whether the UK has the capability of forming a government, and that would be very damaging to us. And what that meant was, in our negotiations, we had to identify between us what were the big issues that could get in the way of forming a successful partnership. And political reform was at the centre of that. It was one, I can't remember the order, but it was one of the very first things that we talked about, because it was clear, that it was an area where Lib Dems for 100 years have advocated reform, and Conservatives for the same period of time have advocated no change. And under those circumstances, we were clear with them that without a serious package of political reform, we simply couldn't reach an accommodation together. But they were equally clear with us about what a serious hurdle that was for their own people to get over. And I think the sort of crucial point I'm trying to make is we didn't leave it to one side and say, well, we'll sort that out later. We faced up to the fact that it was a big difference between us. The coalition negotiations themselves took place in a room like this. There were 4 of us on the Lib Dem side, member of staff, 4 of them on the Conservative side, and we were literally sitting like this. And the civil service, incidentally, had offered to help support our talks and so on, and we said, no, we don't want that. This has to be a negotiation that's carried out between the two parties only, otherwise it will not be sufficiently resilient. And we talked about the different elements of political reform, of reform of the voting system, of devolving further taxation powers to the Scottish Parliament, of reform of the House of Lords, and so on and so forth. And in the end, on each of those things, we were able to come to a position which I think comes to the second question about being a smaller party and the bargaining power. I mean, the truth is in these situations that whilst you've got one party that's larger and one party that's smaller, the Conservatives, I think, had won support of 37% of the voters. We had the support of 23% of the voters, so 1 in 4 British people nearly had voted Liberal Democrats. So that is a very significant mandate to take into those sorts of conversations. And both parties need to agree in order to form a government. Our party wouldn't agree if we just left aside a whole lot of our important things, the top policies in our manifesto, because we said, well, don't worry, they're bigger, so we can't possibly do that. In those initial discussions, you are in a position where, because the two partners have to agree, both sides have a lot of power in the situation, and it's not really about how big or small you are. It's about both sides having an interest in wanting to see a good outcome and a government formed. And I think as well as being very aware of your own bottom lines, the thing you care about most, the things you want to achieve, I think there needs to be a degree of generosity. In other words, not just a recognition of what's important to you, but also a recognition of what's important to the other person on the other side of the table. So, just like we had our top lines, so the Conservatives had their top lines, and we needed to make sure that both could be accommodated. The difference between negotiating with your partners and your own MPs is so it's that, you know, you're on the same side as your own MPs, and in the end, your partners are in another political party, and you have an interest in forming a government. But but with your own MPs, you know, you have a bond of shared values, shared ideas, shared thinking over a long period of time that you need to take forward together. So, and you're going to be working together not just for the period of this government, but for the period of many parliaments to follow. So there's a very different approach. Also, you're accountable to your own MPs. Now, as I said earlier, our parliamentary party had to be persuaded to support it. And so that's important. I mean, clearly, once you're in government, then, you know, there are things that as ministers you can know and be aware of that you're not always able to share with other colleagues. And so, you know, there's a different dynamic there. But it is still the case that, you know, as a senior member of the cabinet, you know, I'm also accountable to the Liberal Democrat Parliamentary Party. You know, go and speak to them about things that I'm working on, hear their views, try and take them on board. And, you know, at the same time as governing together with the Conservatives, we're also preparing our own ideas, our own policies, our own manifesto for the next election, which we will fight on in the election. And the Conservatives will be doing the same in their tribe, as it were. And so it's quite a difficult balance sometimes.
In terms of the mechanics of negotiation, do you actually question the validity of your opponent's beliefs? For example, they have a policy and you say, well, we can't negotiate on that because you shouldn't be saying that in the first place. My other question is regarding how much way each of you gave. Do you think that you eventually gave more way than the Conservatives, or do you think that it was completely equal on both sides?
Questioning the validity of your opponent's beliefs. No, I think you have to. If you've agreed to go in, if you've agreed to go into the situation where you're trying to negotiate together, then you know, if you simply believe that the people you're dealing with are completely ideologically in the wrong place, then you probably wouldn't have entered into the process in the first place. You have to respect and understand the views of the people you're dealing with, even if you disagree with them. I think there's a difference between disagreement and questioning the validity of their opinions, not least because they've persuaded many millions of our fellow countrymen and women to vote for them. And so, you know, whilst you might disagree with what their ideas or the policies that they're putting forward, you can't question the validity of it because they're in the position that they're in because they've persuaded large numbers of people to vote for it. In a democracy, that's the test. But equally, they have to take the same approach to what you're saying. And you then have to understand what's possible and what isn't for both parties and try and form an approach to governing within those parameters. So I think you do need to understand your opponent's beliefs and you do need to understand what they're putting forward. But equally, you need to be clear about what your own bottom lines are. I think that's the way to handle it. I think if you went into a room and started off by saying, well, we think you're completely wrong on everything and your beliefs are completely misguided, it would not necessarily be the best way to get the goodwill you need to do something that has not happened for 60 or 70 years in this country.
Did you carry out any sort of risk analysis in terms of the impact from not just your members but even the people who vote for Liberal Democrats? Because I'm sure there must have been something there. You know, different scenarios. What's the response going to be?
Yeah, I mean, we did spend time thinking about what the risks of different scenarios were. I would say that was mainly a political analysis in terms of, you know, to what extent would we as a party be able to would we be willing to engage in certain sorts of arrangements with different parties? You know, would the Lib Dems be willing to engage in a confidence supply arrangement with the Conservatives or a coalition with the Labour Party? So we spent a lot of time thinking that through. And of course, you know, those things are bound to have an impact on the people who vote for you, because for some of the people who voted Liberal Democrat, perhaps they'd done so where Labour might have been their second choice, or they might have switched from Labour to back us. Others may have come from Conservatives as well as the people who are established Lib Dem voters. But also there's a challenge, which is one that I think is a really good challenge for a political party, which is that, in our case, we were moving from being the kind of longest-serving party of opposition in this country, 70 years as an opposition party, which does mean that you, as well as attracting voters who choose you on principle, you also attract some people who choose you as a protest against the government of the day. You're moving from that position to being the newest party of government in this country. And for those people who've perhaps chosen to support you as a protest against something or other that's gone on in recent years, for some of those people at least, it's going to just be say, well, no, we're not, perhaps there are some people who would say, well, we never expected you to be in government, that's why we voted for you. We knew from the very start that if we went into government, that those are people who might be put off. I think that I think political parties are there to organise people who share the same ideas and values to try and change the country. And you can change the country in a number of ways, but in a democracy, being elected to government is one of the best ways to change your country. So it's part of what a political party is about. That when you get that opportunity, you need to be willing to take it under the right conditions.
So looking forward to 2015, I'm sure you're doing that now anyway. Based on that experience, would you say now that your sort of positioning has changed in terms of being in government, you probably have a different set of people voting for you? Because they'll view you as a different party now, not a protest party, but actually someone who can deliver, who's been in government. Will you be sort of pitching yourself to a new group of voters even going forward, looking at yourself as a proper, electable sort of, a sort of power party in a sense?
Yeah, I think partly. I mean, I think there's a lot of voters who've stayed with us, but then there are some who have who've left us, and there are others to whom we will seek to appeal. And a lot of that is. I remember for in my own constituency, for every person that I met who said, "Well, I'm going to vote for you because I don't like so and so or so and so," I also met people who said, "Well, I really like what you say, but you've got no chance of being in power, so I'm never going to vote for you." And perhaps people would therefore question whether, as a party, you had the capability to be in government, or whether you had the staying power to be in government, whether you have the willingness to do the difficult things as well as the easy things. And so I think there is also a substantial body of people who will be willing to consider the Liberal Democrats. We have to persuade them, but who would consider us, who perhaps hadn't done so before. And I think one of the things that we have to do is to show people that that the things that we've done in government, represent our values. That we've shown that we can be trusted on the economy and with people's money, and that I would say we can be more trusted to keep the economy strong than the Labour Party can, but that we are more committed to fairness in society than the Conservatives are. And so, if you want both of those things, both a strong economy and a fair society, then the Liberal Democrats are the political party that is best able to deliver those two things together. And so that's the argument that we'll be making. I hope it will be successful. We'll all see in due course whether it is or not.
So I'm just wondering, I mean, you've highlighted your 4 policies that you thought were important, around cutting taxes for the poorest, people premium, greener economy and political reform of various sorts. And I wonder, in that isn't the issue of student tuition fees, and I wonder, with the benefit of hindsight, you think it should have been, and it goes to the point of, was it highlighted as a risk? Because there's a lot's been made of it, and do you think actually, hang on, we should have made that a priority or shouldn't have? And is there something about, because you said you prepared for this 9 months prior to the negotiations, and so I'm wondering at that time was it identified? Because it sounds like one of those things that you've given way on, and I wonder if with the benefit of hindsight you'd have done differently.
Look, clearly this is an area where we've been particularly challenged. I mean, and it's not for nothing that this is the issue on which Nick Clegg has stood up and made a public apology on it. But the truth is, it was not one of the issues that we highlighted on the front page of our manifesto. It was not one of the things that we'd selected as being one of the most important policy asks for us as a party in terms of the case we were putting to the country. It was it was in our manifesto, it was in one of the sections, and it was there, but it was not something that we had spent a lot of time in the campaign or in our political position, if you like, really highlighting as a principal thing. Of course, I think that the issue there was that, you know, Lib Dem MPs, including myself, we'd all signed a pledge, which I think for a lot of people, understandably, took on a different quality to it being a policy in the manifesto. You know, look, it has to be said as well that the debate we'd had within the party before the election for the manifesto was about making sure we had policies that were financially realistic, that were, in the economic scenario that we faced, deliverable. And, you know, I don't think we fully lived up to that challenge in terms of, I think it's probably the only area we didn't live up to that challenge in the policy we had on student fees. We were also in a position where, you know, both Labour and Conservative parties had supported the Brown Review and had said that they wanted to increase fees. In the scenario where both other parties think the same thing, it's actually much harder for us to have sway.
Did it surprise you though when the backlash came, or did you kind of expect it?
Look, I think it's fair to say that we expected some, you know, significant, you know, response, you know, public, from some people. I think probably the ferocity of it did take us aback a wee bit. But also I think we just hadn't, you know, I think to be candid, the party hadn't just weighed up, you know, what this pledge meant to people, as compared to it being one of a number of policies in a manifesto where inevitably in a coalition negotiation you can't get everything you want. You can get some of the things you want, and the other side has to get some of the things that they want, and that's the balance. And I think, you know, part of it is about just making sure that that as we think through our next manifesto, you know, all the policies we have there are deliverable, not least financially, in the climate that the country's going to face over the next few years.
You talked about how preparation is really important and how you had a kind
Yes.
of working group leading up to the election. Or were there any kind of conversations between parties that obviously wouldn't have been publicised at the time to prepare for such an eventuality? And leading up to 2015, if you didn't before, is that something that you would consider in order to work out, you know, the areas that you want to come to some consensus on before you get to the, oh my goodness, this is the result, we've got to decide in 5 days how to go forward?
Yeah.
And the second aspect of my question is, you said that a real strength of the Lib Dems was to have all of the internal processes in place to, again, agree whether to go into coalition or not, and implied that the Conservatives didn't have that in place. Do you feel like that put you in a stronger position, or do you feel that actually the fact that the other party didn't have those internal processes and didn't perhaps come to such a democratic decision internally has made it more difficult to have consensus across both parties?
The answer is no, we didn't have conversations with other parties about trying to pre-negotiate different things, and we won't do that this time, because in the end, the choice here has to be in the hands of the British people. You know, each party has to present its own ideas and own views to the British people in the general election, and then we'll have a result, and people will vote for who they want to vote for, they'll elect who they want to elect, and if we have another hung parliament in future, which we may do, then just like this time round, it will be the responsibility of those elected to work together to try and deliver a government from the result that the British people have chosen. For us as Liberal Democrats, you know, we you know, there's always a risk that if you have a private discussion, it becomes public, and then people assume that that means you have a preference one way or another. That's something that clearly you know, I would very much want to avoid. I think for the first time, Liberal Democrats took up the offer that's always made to opposition parties to engage with senior civil servants, and that's about discussing your ideas. It's about testing those with the senior officials in government departments. So. You know, various colleagues went to see the permanent secretary in the department that they were shadowing, and that was a kind of useful experience. You know, I had several meetings with Nick Clegg, and I had several meetings with the then cabinet secretary, more about what the process would be, in these sets of circumstances, and that was important because it meant that the civil service had been thinking about this, that there were processes in place. For example, you had two parties who had been in opposition, the Liberal Democrats and Conservatives, using government buildings to carry out negotiations. Now, I guess it could potentially have been within the rights of the existing government to say, no, you can't use government buildings for it. But actually, it was constitutionally proper that we were able to, because that, it enabled the talks to be facilitated in the right sort of way. And so that was important. I think having our internal processes in place was in the two sentences that I gave earlier, was a strength for Liberal Democrats. It meant that we knew where we stood and people knew where we stood. Our negotiating partners knew where we stood in terms of the processes that we'd have to go through, and it also meant that everyone in the party had an opportunity to have their say, and that's a strength as you go forward.
Perhaps you could talk a little bit about some of the personal reasons as to why some people observed the coalition came together, because the small group of people on your side and the small group of people on the Tories, a lot of people observed that actually politically, although ideologically you had your own kind of party lines, in many respects you came from a very similar kind of political class, and to a large extent that's probably why you got on, and in many respects, I don't know whether this is fair or not, but that you probably had more in common with each other than various wings of your own kind of party at the grassroots and rank and file, like certain backbenchers on the Tory side, as an example. If you hear some of George Osborne's views on a number of social issues, they're quite fairly liberal and quite distant from the views held by his backbenchers and perhaps the core Tory vote.
In terms of personal ties, I'm not sure I really accept that, actually. I mean, I think if you look, certainly, you can ask Conservatives about their side, but if you look on our side, I think you find, a group of MPs who come from quite different backgrounds, different parts of the country in terms of our negotiating team. I'm from the Highlands of Scotland. I'll come back to that in a second. Andrew Stunnell from the Northwest, represented a seat in the Northwest. David Laws in Somerset. Chris Huhne on the South Coast. So you had quite a geographical diversity. People who'd done very different things, came from very different kind of social backgrounds. I think what we had in common, and with our Conservative colleagues too, was that we were going into those negotiations and discussions with a view to trying to make them successful, if we could, because that's what the country needed. But I don't really accept this analysis that says that there's a sort of political class and it's different from everybody else, and that's what it seems to me when you look around around Parliament, you see a whole range of people who come from a whole range of different backgrounds, and I think that we need to make it is true that we need to make our Parliament and our democracy more diverse, that we need more elected representatives who are female, who are from black and minority ethnic backgrounds, but nonetheless, there is, I think, a diversity of social background. I mean, I explained my own background when I started out, and I think it's important that we work to maintain and we work to improve that at the next election and beyond. And that's why, as a party, for example, we have a program to mentor and support candidates from groups that are underrepresented in the Liberal Democrats, to try and make sure at the next election we have a more diverse parliamentary party than we do at the moment.
I wanted to know, did you get any professional help? Because negotiation skills are like a profession themselves. I think I was reading a recent report where if you're in an interview and they offer you a job and offer you a salary, for every second that you're quiet, your salary goes up £300. So did you have any sort of silences and they went, oh, okay, we'll give you this as well? Was there any strategy, any sort of professional help, or did you just learn this off your own back? On a personal note, a couple of weeks ago I was in New Lanark, Falls of Clyde, and hopefully Aviemore next. How did you find the transition from your beautiful homeland to the concrete jungle?
No, we didn't have professional help. We didn't, in the sense of we didn't have a company or whatever come in and tell us how to go about it. we were very fortunate that one member of our negotiating team, Andrew Stunnell, is someone who had a lot of experience of negotiation, particularly in his days in local government. He'd actually written a book in the 1980s about negotiating within a local authority setting. It was a guide for Liberal Democrats in hung councils. So I think he was a sort of secret weapon, if you like, within our team, and I think particularly on the sort of psychology and this of entering into negotiations, I'd say that his views and his advice were really quite important to that. And in relation to what was it like making the transition from the kind of remote wilds of the north of Scotland to the big smoke, I mean, I had been an MP since 2005. I'd worked in London before that for the Britain in Europe campaign, so it wasn't an entirely alien environment to me. But I'd say that having a constituency in the north of Scotland to which I could return equally felt like a very great strength indeed.